Chapter 3 A Strange Port in a Storm. The morning was well along before there was good enough light of day in the line camp so the boys could see by, but they'd been up for quite a spell, and by candlelight had cooked and ate a good breakfast of hot biscuits and bacon, washed down with plenty of black coffee, no eggs. There hadn't been much steady sleep for the boys that night. Without bedding, they'd stretched out on the hay-filled, nailed-to-the-wall two-story bunks, and took only their chaps off, which was used for covering on legs and feet. The old line camp, being used mostly during summers, hadn't been kept very weather-tight. The daubing and chinking was gone in some places, and the snow driven hard by cold winds, sifted in between the logs, and made fair-sized snow banks on the floor and bunks. But it was very much better than being outside at that. The little tin stove, which heated quick and died near as quick, was kept a-going most of the time by one or the other of the boys. Waking up at being chilled, would get up and tend to it. The coffee pot was heated each time, a cup of it, a cigarette, and all was comfortable again for a spell, all including the colt, which now, being out of the storm, and even though his blanket taken off of him, was very comfortable at all times. The blanket had been switched onto Roper's back soon as the saddle was pulled off, was given a double feed of the grain, which was kept stored in steel drums for that purpose, and backed against the cabin for a wind break, was also some comfortable. Inside, it had taken the colt some time to rest and warm up. He'd, of course, laid or fell down near as soon as the door had been closed after him, and when some hours later he revived enough to raise his head to look around and his nose brushed against some hay, was when he revived some more. It was hay padding the lower bunk where Brad was laying, and no telling of how long it had been there. So's the colt wouldn't be running into things or falling over the stove during the night. Brad had tied him to his bunk, and that went well with him, especially after he'd thawed out and got a whiff of the hay in that bunk, and even though that whiff told him the hay was old, matted and broken, fine in some places from much laying on it, was hay, and he was mighty hungry. He ate all the hay to within his reach while laying down. Then he got up to get more, and Brad, feeling him nosing around his feet, edged closer to the wall and kicked some more his way, feeling relieved that the colt was up and a-coming again. When him and the other boys got up to cook and eat breakfast, the colt had about cleaned up the foot end of the bunk, and also reached up to get what more hay was hanging over the edge of the bunk above. I've heard of folks being et out of house and home, says the writer who'd used the bunk, as he climbed down from it, but I never heard of anybody having their bedding et out from under 'em while they slept. That's all right now, Brad grinned. Don't cry, I'll feed the culprit so he won't touch your bedding any more. So, while the boys ate their breakfast, the colt was also eating his. It was grain which Brad had placed on the flooring of the bunk. Roper, still in the shelter of the cabin, was later taken care of with another good feed of grain, but it took a little time to get to him, for as Brad opened the door he was met by a wind so stiff that he had a hard time closing it again, and at a space to one side of the cabin was a drift from 4 to 8 feet deep in places. But Roper wasn't suffering any. He was in a space between the drift and the cabin, and was now well surrounded with shelter, and with the good feed of grain he'd fare along well. So well, Brad thought, that he'd turn the colt out with him after a spell, when it might get warmer and the blizzard let up some. But as one after another of the boys went out in the storm to either dig up the woodpile and chop some wood or get some water at the open spring below the cabin, they returned in a sort of hurry to hug the stove, shaking their heads as they stomped their feet and warmed their hands, remarking that the storm was even worse than it had been the evening before, and it'd be about impossible to get the horses out of the shelter they now was in and make them face it, which they would have to do all the rest of the way to the ranch. There'd be only one way, says one of the boys, as he reached for the steaming coffee pot, and that'd be to make 'em back all the way. That was said so serious that the other boys was caught looking foolish for at first believing he really meant it. But it was seen there could be no going on, not in that storm. It was one of these first heavy storms that usually come in the fall of the year or early part of winter, after which the weather most always turns and stays good for a month or so, or till winter really sets in. There's no telling how long such storms might last. Sometimes they'll blow themselves out in a day, and then again they might last off and on for a couple of weeks. If it let up by noon, the boys thought they could still make the ranch with the horses some time during the night. In the meantime, they'd be busy themselves at cooking up something to do for the noon and evening meal, something besides bacon and biscuits. But being nothing is kept in such camps that would freeze, there wasn't much in variety to cook, only rice, beans, raisins, and dried apples, all put in cans to keep from the pack rats. While what was to be cooked was being decided on, Brad had set a bucket of water on the stove to get the chill off, and gave it to the colt, which he drank right down, but he couldn't quite finish another one. It was then Roper's turn, and that horse had Brad pack 3 of them through the storm to the spring, back to the stove, and then out to him before his thirst was quenched. It was a lot of fuss, maybe, but to Brad, and in such weather, them ponies was sure worth it. It was along near noon when Brad, going out again, this time for his share of wood cutting, thought the wind had of a sudden warmed up considerably. It was as strong as ever, and still bringing snow, but it had all the feelings of a coming chinook to him, only it was still coming from the same direction, and there was no telling as yet. Anyhow, it wasn't so cold now, he thought, so the colt could be out for a while anyway, and so long as he wouldn't have to buck the drifts in steady traveling, it'd do him good and only limber him up. So the colt was let out in the whirling snow again, brought in the shelter alongside of Roper, and there that good horse was parted with his blanket. It was again squaw-hitched to cover the colt, for coming out of the warm cabin would have been sort of hard on this thin hide without that blanket. Besides, Roper, being born and raised in that country, had seldom been blanketed, and he'd spent many a long winter on the open range there, coming out slick and fat at springtime. Rice and bacon, mixed hot biscuits and coffee, then another mixture of rice and raisins for dessert, and plenty more coffee, made up a good and warming noon meal. Then the boys stretched out on the bunks to just relax some, smoke and talk, and feeling sure the storm would last, and so they couldn't hit out. That day there was nothing for them to do but that, just talk or sleep for a while. The talk was started with that of the weather. When one of the boys remarked that if he had some of that steam heat which was at them hotels in the east, pocketed in a way so he could use it as he rode, he'd start out with the horses, blizzard or no blizzard. That don't make sense, said Brad, acting serious. How about the horses? I expect you'd want a steam-heated corral on wheels to drive 'em in. That didn't make sense either, but it started the talk, and talking of steam heat took 'em back to the east, where they'd just been for a couple of weeks to attend a big rodeo. They'd had some fun there and came back with less than what they went with, even after the hard contesting they'd done and winnings they'd made. Brad had been the only one to come back with something to show for the trip. He'd won first money in both bronc and steer riding, and with his expenses and buying the colt, he came back with about half of his winnings. Brad's buying of the colt had been a puzzle to the two riders, and if they knew how much he'd paid for him, it would have been a way beyond a puzzle. It would have been a plain case of where he should be tied down, his head examined, and his money taken away from him, for as they said, mighty fine range colts of this one's age could be got for $10 and $20, and not spindle-legged things that have to be babied, blanketed, and brought into the house like a house plant every time a cool breeze came up. Anyhow, I'll bet he'll come to outrun any horse in this country, Brad had answered, and he'll make good time in contest roping. That last had brought a snort from one of the boys, and the other agreed with him when he said, I'd be scared stiff to rope a sick rabbit from him for fear he'd be jerked down or break a leg when the rope tightened, let alone roping and stopping a big husky yearling calf. Talking about rodeos, and then the colt again and the line camp that stormy day. Brad was finally asked just how much he was paid to take that colt away. Sure, nobody what knew horses would pay real money for any such. That of a sudden made Brad wonder if them boys knew how much he did pay for the colt, but hardly thinking so, he answered that what he paid for him wasn't much as compared to what he'd win with him, and let it go at that. You wait till you see him step out and make fast time in roping, he went on. Then you fellers will be laughing the other way. How long will we have to wait, and who's going to take care of him while he's growing? You're gone most of the time, and you know that Cal, the ranch owner, won't allow him to stay in the bunkhouse with us. All three grinned, and the talk went on as to the prospects of the coming winter. Jim, one of the boys, was for staying at the ranch and just make a hand of himself. He'd been to enough contests the past summer to do him for a long spell. As for Red, the other rider, he was sort of undecided and would wait until Brad crossed the mountains and let him know how the land laid as to contests there, how many and what the prizes would be in that warmer land along the coast, on down to the border. There wouldn't be much doing in rodeos until after the first of the year, but up to that time there'd be considerable doing in range work, and so Brad and Jim and Red was always welcome on the Cal Goodwin outfit, known the country around as the Hippo Circle on Hip Bone. That brand was for cattle only. There was many different horse brands. The three riders had worked for the Hippo off and on for some years. They was three good cowboys, good on the range as well as on the rodeo grounds. And Cal Goodwin had all faith in their handling of his bucking stock, which he contracted to furnish different rodeos, as though he went along himself, but he seldom did. Cal was getting old and he didn't care much for traveling any more. He'd done plenty of it during his racetrack days. for at one time he'd owned quite a string of race horses, and raised many good ones, plenty good enough that they made him quite a stake, so that, with a few of his best horses, he began to cover more territory, taking in the bigger tracks, and his stake in winnings on his horses swelled up till he thought he was sure enough racehorse king. And he was for a spell. Then his wife died while bringing a daughter to the world. The daughter lived, but right at the time she wasn't enough to fill the gap for the loss of the mother. She was placed in the best of care, and Cal went on with his ponies, sort of wild, and to higher stakes. He went to the top and stayed there for longer than was expected. Then the big stakes began to fall, and as the pins began to get knocked out from under him, he played his ponies still higher, until one fine morning he found himself borrowing railroad fare to go back home with. All the worth of his horses and stables had gone into turf dust. But not his ranch. He'd kept that clean and sacred to the memory of his wife, and it would be kept so for their daughters. As the years went by, Cal contented himself with the ranch, and to breeding up the few hundred cattle he had, also some good saddle and draft horses. No more racing stock for him. That had been a lot of fun and experience, and he'd found out that there was as much to learn in the racehorse game as there is in the cattle game, that knowing and handling both well was too much for any one man. So, when the fun was over, he was sort of glad of it, in a way, and so as to get back to his ranch and cattle. That was the game he was born and raised into, and the one he really knew, busying himself as he had in having the whole ranch fixed up. He didn't have no time to be lonesome nor grieve, and he often rode and worked along after his men had quit for the day. The old ranch had been much neglected during his horse racing spree, also much of his stock had strayed, and now that he had his little girl Virginia to do things for, he'd set his whole heart to fix it all up, and she and her mother would like it. That included the big ranch house and grounds surrounding first, then all other buildings, corrals and fences, and the gathering in of the stock that had strayed. As Virginia came to her 4th year, Cal got a good old-fashioned lady ranch cook and housekeeper. She was as good at fixing up homey medicines as she was at good food or even fancy puddings, and when the children come to the ranch, she was so well taken care of, if not better, than at the special and expensive home where she'd been kept since infancy. Cal had been mighty pleased at the natural way little Virginia took to the ranch. From the first day of her first summer there, she acted like this wasn't at all new to her, but very much at home, from the house to the corrals and horse pasture, and spread very much cheer over the whole outfit. A couple of years later, Cal got Virginia a playmate of her choice to come and stay with her, also a tutor, and as she was very happy to stay at the ranch, it also made Cal the same and much contented while she grew up there, most always in the open and often riding alongside of him. Then there come another game to sort of draw Cal's attention. It was that of the rodeo, where cowboys contested and matched their skill against one another in bronco busting, steer roping, and other range work in arenas and for prizes. Cal didn't at first think such doings would amount to much, but as years went by, the rodeos got more and more numerous and bigger right along. He sort of perked his ears at that, went to see a few of the rodeos now and again, and figured that there was a real man's game. This one to be on the square, no doping of stock and no buying of riders. He understood this game, and when one day an old friend of the horse racing days drove in to the ranch to see him, he'd got to know some more of the rodeo and its doings, for that old friend, after going busted on the fast horses, had borrowed what money he could and invested it into the rough ones, the kind that twisted up in the air in buck jumps, landed hard and stayed pretty well in one spot, and trying to buck off their riders. They was plenty speedy, but not at all of the straightaway kind. He'd done fairly well in contracting to furnish them horses for rodeos, and paid off what he'd borrowed. Then he'd got some longhorn Mexico steers and bulls for the wild steer riding and bulldogging, and now he figured he had about as good a string of rodeo stock as could be gathered, but he had no place of his own to keep them, and that fall, after the rodeo season was over, he'd come to see if Cal would winter 'em for him. Counting all, there'd be about 100 head. Cal had always allowed plenty of range and stacked feed for his stock, and consequences was he had it to spare in case of long hard winters or droughts. Even at that, he didn't care to take on any more stock, but for an old friend who was sort of under hard circumstances, he agreed he would. That's how come that some time later there come a-trailing the wildest-looking bunch of horses and longhorns Cal had seen for a long time, and the riders who trailed 'em up had been Brad, Jim, and Red, as good a cowboys as the stock was, plenty tough, and the same boys who was now in the line camp, waiting for the storm to ease up, and with practically the same stock, only a few had been replaced or added on. This outlaw stock, now belonging to Cal, had belonged to him for some years, and the way that come about wasn't through any of Cal's choice of dickering. The stock was sort of shoved onto him on account of his friend taking sick, laying in the hospital for months, and finally dying. Having no one to care for him, Cal paid hospital, doctor, and burial fees, also what was still due to the Longhorns, and with the ranging and feeding of the stock, he didn't get it at no bargain. He done that only for the sake of an old friend, but he'd got himself some stock on his hands that had been easier to get than it was to be rid of, and even though he'd lost his racing stock that had been a gamble he'd more or less jumped into, but home at the ranch and with regular stock dealings, he wasn't the one to sacrifice and sell at a loss. He wouldn't have the big ranch if he had, knowing that he couldn't sell the horses as work stock and the wiry longhorns as beef cattle and get anywheres near the amount he'd put out on 'em. He'd advertised 'em for sale in many western newspapers from border to border and as stock for rodeo purposes, which they sure enough was. Only a few nibbles came from that, none worth considering. He kept the horses for over a year without any use of 'em, when they only accumulated more fat and meanness, if that was possible. Then being he'd kept Brad and the other two boys to ride on the ranch when not following the rodeos, it came to him that he himself could promote contracts for the use of them in rodeos. Them three boys could well handle the shipping and care of the stock for him, for whatever rodeo he might contract with. Besides, the boys could dig up and arrange some more contracts to his approval, and that way he would at least get some returns from what he'd put in the stock. Talking it over with the boys, it was more than agreeable with them, and besides getting regular wages right along, they would also get a percentage on every contract that Cal agreed to. It was also agreed that Brad, on account of being more out to contesting than either Jim or Red, was appointed chief and would have full charge of the stock. All three would be allowed to attend any rodeo at any time whether Cal's stock would be used at such rodeos or not, but would need to be at the ranch for regular cow work and horse breaking when not busy at contesting. That was all agreeable too. If he'd looked the country over, Cal couldn't got better agents and handlers for his stock for the rodeo game. They knew the ropes of that game. They was well liked, and being they contested in other rodeos besides where Cal's stock was contracted, and played no favorites as to judges, all went well. The first year, and without an extra worry or move on his part, Cal netted enough to fill quite a hole in what he'd been out on the stock. The following year was still better, and then's when he decided to keep that bunch of outlaws, for besides being profitable, they kind of kept his blood a-tingling in hearing of how hard his horses was to set and his long horns to ride, rope and bulldog. He got to have his favorites amongst the outlaws, the same as he had with his race stock, and even though there was no betting, when his buckers came back after a summer's round of rodeos, and a few of his top ones hadn't been stuck to or qualified on by some of the best riders, he felt about the same thrill as when one of his thoroughbreds came in the money. Another thing was with that string was that when some of the horses he'd raise and would have broke was inclined to turn to the bad, he'd just turn 'em in along with the buckers and have 'em make the rounds of the rodeos till that was out of his system. If they didn't quit, well and good, so long as they could buck hard enough. If not, they could then easy be sold as broke, at least from bucking, and without a bit of harm to their spirit, for none of 'em was made to buck, and none was abused in keeping them from it. Sometimes even some of the old buckers would quit, and them that had been good and a long time at the game was pensioned to spend the rest of their lives in idleness and right along with the good faithful old cow horses, on good feed, shade, and shelter. There was always plenty of young stock to take the place of the bad as well as the good, and both kinds was given every chance to be either, according to their nature. In the line camp, and switching from the talk on the colt to the prospects for the coming winter, the boys then began to reminisce some on the past years and when they'd first took on the handling of Cal's rodeo stock, and summing it up as they had time and again before, they figured they was riding pretty, doing very well as compared to most other cowboys who followed the contest. They had a place to come to whenever they was through, and their wages and work going on just the same. They never was broke, all outside of Red, who was bound to draw ahead on his wages every once in a while. Jim had a failing for fancy silver-mounted riggings, but he managed to save some of his money, sometimes for more. As for Brad, having no fault excepting of shooting out bright lights now and again on account, as he'd say, they hurt his eyes, had saved quite a stake in spite of having to pay for many lights and fines and cartridges, and with all the reminiscing, it would always come to them, as it did now, that after all the excitement, thrills and spills and rodeos was over, how sort of glad and relieved they felt to come back to the ranch and rest up with just plain hard range work. It was like their home, only they felt more free, and that's the cowboy's big weakness, to be free. The cabin getting chilly the while they talked, one of the boys went to look at the fire. It had burned out, had been out for quite a while, and surprised that it wasn't so cold, he opened the door to look outside. It had quit snowing, but the wind was still blowing, as strong as ever, only now from another direction, and warm, so warm that after the cold of not long before it near felt hot. It was the Chinook Brad had figured would come. At the sound of Chinook, all three went outside. It was good the storm was over at least for the time, and knowing that a storm often follows a Chinook, they figured that now they could get to the ranch before the other storm would come. With the warm wind, the snow had quit drifting. It was now packing, melting, and crumbling in layers as the wind cut through the drifts like a knife, and from under them little streams started to run on the ground that was now bare of the inches of snow that had covered it only an hour or so before. Looking down towards the creek bottom and breaks where the horses had hit for shelter during the storm, it was seen that they'd now come out and was grazing on higher and open land. The sight of them reminded Brad of Roper and the colt which he'd left in the shelter of the cabin, and now, even before getting to the corner to look around and see if they was still there, he knew they wouldn't be, and they wasn't, for they'd also went on to feed and maybe was now amongst the other horses. "Afoot, I see," Red grinned at him. "Better get your baby." In before this wind switches and brings on another blizzard, or he'll sure turn into a statue. It had got late in the afternoon, too late so it'd be of any advantage to start out with the horses. If the Chinook kept up during the night, or even only part of it, the snow would be most all gone, and maybe turning some colder by morning. The ground wouldn't be so slushy, and the going would then be easier. They would get an early start on the next morning, Brad said, and get to the ranch in good time that afternoon. That settled, and the woodpile now bared of snow and in plain sight, Red went to work on cutting and chopping some of it, enough to do for the rest of that day and for the night, also enough for the boys who'd be coming along with the cattle, for traveling slower and making another camp. They wouldn't get to the line camp until the next day, and being it's the custom in the cow country that wood burned should always be replaced for the next traveler, Red started in on the job. Jim would rely on him some time, but right then the stove and what should be fixed for supper seemed to take a lot of his attention. While that was going on, Brad edged away, and Red watched him from the corner of his eye, let him go for a ways, then hollered, "Just look for a horse blanket," he grinned. "Then look under it, and there he'll be." Brad walked on towards the grazing horses. It was easy to pick out the outlaws from the used saddle horses, for at the sight of him they began to spook and run in a big circle around him, heads up and a snorting, while the saddle horses stood still and just looked or grazed. Neither the colt nor Roper was amongst them, but was soon located off a ways, the both of 'em grazing side by side through a patch of aspens. Brad came closer to them without being seen, and coming to a bare ledge of rock he sat down, rolled a cigarette, and for nothing else to do, watched 'em. He watched as the colt, his head close to Roper's, was grazing in the same spots Roper would paw the snow off for the good grass underneath, better grass than where it was more open and the Chinook had bared of snow. Brad had to grin some as the colt followed Roper step by step and even tried to root him out of the grass he'd bared. He'd follow him from patch to patch, then watch him paw. Curious as any kid watching a grown-up cracking nuts, and as ready to pounce on the meat as any kid would, but all this watching wasn't for pure curiosity. It was also for learning, and at one time when Roper wouldn't be rooted away, Brad was surprised to see the colt go to one side a few feet, and with his small hooves paw up his own grass. As he watched, Brad seen that he'd do that near every time. Roper wouldn't let him in on what he dug up, and as that, he had to grin some more. "Learning pretty fast, young feller," he says, half aloud. "Didn't think that with the hundreds of years of high breeding and man's steady care you'd keep the instinct of rustling your own food. But I'm thinking that out here there'll be other instincts come back to you which has long been asleep in the blood of your past generations." The lids of the little tin stove was rattling long before daybreak the next morning, as the boys got up and made ready for an early start. Breakfast was soon cooked and over with, and then the coffee pot made its usual rounds, dishes and camp cleaned up, and after a few more cigarettes it was light enough so the horses could be corralled. A fresh horse fed grain and kept up for the night was soon saddled, and Jim rode out to bring in the saddle horses. And when a short time later they was corralled, Brad seen that the colt was right there amongst 'em. It had been his first night in the open western country, and it being warm, he seemed to have done well. It had turned considerable cooler during morning, but the wind had died down, and now the colt's blanket was pulled off a little feed of grain while the buckers was being gathered and brought up, and he was ready for travel. As the boys had figured, the traveling was much better than it would have been the evening before. The snow, all but a few scattering banks, was gone. The water had run off the now bare earth, and when the horses was all bunched and started out, they took to the open in good shape, the colt right by Roper. And now that he'd had a good rest, feed and water, and wasn't hindered by the blanket, he went along like a good one. There was no deep snow nor strong cold wind to buck against now, and at the start he'd been good for a run if the others would only start one. But he sort of got over that after a time, and did as the other horses did, trot or walk along, stop for a few bites of bunch grass, and trot and walk along some more as the bunch was steady being drove on. It got warmer along towards noon, and under a chinooky sky, no sun, the ground got a little heavy to travel on in some places. There was a stop made by a deep creek, where the horses drank and grazed for a spell. The boys just rested their saddles, meaning they got off their horses, hobbled 'em and let 'em graze, while they themselves just sat on a dead tree and smoked. There was no lunch brought along, for like with most cowboys, such is seldom thought of. In good time the bunch was again started on the way, now on the home stretch, and there'd be no more stops over foothill ridges, across steep callous and ravines. Then rolling land, the bunch trailed along steady, and once again during middle afternoon the colt began to get tired and to lagging behind Roper more and more. Noticing that, Red remarked to Brad, "Looks like your urchin is going to quit again. Better ride on ahead to the ranch and get a team and wagon to take him in, and some more blankets, too, for the poor thing." Brad only grinned at the joking remark, for the colt was doing fairly well, and still would for quite a ways. He did, but when, finally, the bunch was drove over a low pass and down a fair-sized valley, pretty well surrounded by tall mountains, the colt's legs began to get pretty wobbly, and he was going mostly on his nerve and sense of having to go on the rest of the way in. He didn't see the long spread of corrals, sheds, and building, which now wasn't so far in the distance, and when finally he followed the bunch of horses into one of the corrals, he hardly noticed them, nor even the dry and warm stable Brad right away helped him into. Once inside, he just slowly laid down on some dry waste hay, closed his eyes, and drew a long, relaxing breath, which all went as much as to say, this must be home. Chapter 4. Home on the Range. As comfortable as the colt was made in the long log stable and in the company of other horses, which he heard munching hay in their stalls, the boys in the bunk house was also as comfortable, for after a good warm supper, then back into their own beds, there was no more thought of the steam-heated hotel rooms. The night went by like in no time. A good breakfast spread out by the ranch cook, which was nicknamed Grouch, on account he was just the opposite, and then, as the boys went back to the bunkhouse for a smoke, old Cow came to join 'em there, to sort of resume his welcome of the evening before. Brad was the first one he picked on, and putting his hand out to him, he smiled and says, "I'm mighty proud of you, my boy, for bringing home the honor of 3 first prizes for bronc riding this year. I sure want to congratulate you." "Thanks," says Brad, who wasn't much at taking compliments, "but I most likely wouldn't come back with any of the 3 prizes if I'd been riding the tops of your string, Cal. The last contest was the only time where I won first one of yours. It was that loose-jointed blue roan called Thunderhead, and he's not one of your hardest to set, even if he does put on a good show." "Yes," says Cal, sticking up for both Brad and the horse, "and he's bucked off some mighty good riders just the same." So saying, he laid some newspapers and clippings on the table telling of Brad's good riding and winnings. Then he turned to Jim and Red. "You 2 boys didn't do so doggone bad either, and I'm also very proud of you, very pleased with the good contracts too, and the way my stock was handled by you and Brad all the way through. We sure done our best," says Red. "And now don't blame me nor Jim for the addition to the stock." "Addition? What addition?" asked Cal, looking at one after another of the boys. "Ain't you seen it yet?" Red grinned. "It's in one of the empty Stud's box stalls, and for all I think it amounts to the stall is still empty." Not at all bothered at Red's remarks, Brad put on his coat and, starting for the door, says, "Come on, Cal, I'll show it to you," as Red calls him, in the stable, and as the colt raised his head from the filled manger to blink at the 2 men. Cal also done some blinking. Brad led the colt out of the stall, and without saying a word, Cal walked all around him, observing every point. Finally, and without taking his eyes from the colt, he says, "Why, this is a hot blood all the way through, or I've never seen one." Then he asked, "Where and how did you get him?" "Just picked him up at the yards where we shipped from after the last rodeo." Cal rubbed his chin a bit. "Kinda queer," he says. Then he asked, "Know anything about him?" "Some," says Brad. "Plenty enough to satisfy me." "Well, that ought to be enough. But now, what do you aim to do with him?" "Thought I'd give him to Virginia. Maybe she'd like him to train and for a sort of pet." That last came pretty well of a sudden, and Brad surprised himself even as he spoke, for ever since he'd seen the colt, he'd wondered what had prompted him to buy him. As for a rope horse, he knew that he wasn't of the breed nor built that would do, and he'd used that only as an excuse to himself as well as others. Another excuse, which would have been enough by itself, was that he'd took a liking to the colt, but with that, and not wanting to admit it even to himself, was thoughts of Virginia. that she would like him. And now that he'd blurted it out, like as much as to say the colt was a present to her, there was no taking it back, and he was near as surprised in what he'd just said as Cal was of hearing it. Cal rubbed his chin some more, and squinting at Brad, he says, "Mighty fine of you, my boy, and I know Virginia will sure be tickled witless." But he hesitated some. "But doggone it, Brad, I was through with racing stock. Had enough of 'em. Long ago. Lost 'em all about 16 years ago when Virginia was 3 years old." Brad stood mighty silent, not knowing what to say or do. For one thing, he hadn't meant to come right out and say the colt was for Virginia, and another was he didn't know of Cal's stand on thoroughbreds. But it was said and done and over with now, and maybe it was just as well or better that way. Cal walked to the stable door, looked outside a while, and then turned to Brad, who was still standing and just looking at the colt. "Well," he says, "what are you standing there for? Why don't you go up to the house and tell her?" "Guess I won't now," says Brad. "Didn't know of your dealings with thoroughbreds, and that you was through with 'em." Old Cal sort of melted at that. "Don't take me wrong there, Brad," he says. "This just got me kind of sudden, and I spoke before I thought. I ain't got nothing against thoroughbreds, and even if I'm through with 'em, one sure won't hurt. Not at all, when considering how happy Virginia would be in having him. We'll wait and see what she says." They didn't have to wait long, for as the two talked and Brad was currying and brushing the colt, there come a shadow at the stable door, and where Cal had just been standing a few minutes before. It was the slender figure of Virginia herself, and as Cal had blinked in surprise at the sight of the colt, so did she, and so was Cal and Brad right then, blinking at her. She didn't seem to see neither of them as she walked to the colt, and she'd never seen thoroughbreds before, only in pictures. But at the sight of the colt she recognized him as one right away, and just had to touch him to see if he was real. Finally, after feeling of his smooth thin hide along his slim neck and head, then his long fine-boned legs, she looked at her dad, and some excited, she asked her dad, "Where does he come from? Whose is he?" Old Cal, grinning at her excitement, waved a hand towards Brad. "Ask him," he says. She then looked at Brad for an answer, and, "If you really want to know," he says, "you've first got to tell me what you think of him." The girl was kind of stumped at that, and as she stroked the colt's fine mane, she was, for the time, plumb against it as to what to say. And seeing her predicament, also sorta sensing what she wanted to say, Brad went on. "Well," he grinned, "he's from the bluegrass country, and as to whose he is, he's yours if you want him." The girl was now more stumped than before. She looked straight at Brad, like to make sure he meant it, then to her dad, and finally managed to say, "Oh, Dad, is it true? Can I really have him?" Old Cal now looked puzzled, only shrugged his shoulders, and once more waved his hand toward Brad, not saying a word. Virginia was now sure, and in the wink of an eye had her arms around her dad's neck and kissed him. She also got Brad about as quick. That clinched the deal, and he didn't try to duck, and when the two come to, one was again mixed up with the thoroughbred, and the other was without that horse. Now that the colt had changed hands, it didn't take long for the new owner to take charge of him. Brad handed her the halter rope, the curry comb and brush, and grinning at Cal, throwed up his hands. Cal answered with another shrug, and being they now seen they was plumb forgotten, walked out of the stable. During that day and the next, the boys was busy doing nothing much but straightening their personal stuff, what had been brought from the railroad station, also getting an idea on what all was to be done in the line of work which Cal always saved as much of as could for whenever they'd return there, and he usually had a lot of it stacked up, some of it which should have been done before but couldn't without their help, such as with all-range work, rounding up, branding, moving the stock to different winter quarters, shipping of beef cattle, and all such. The longhorn herd of steers and bulls came trailing in a couple of days later, and them was put in special tight pasture of good grass and shelter, and by long sheds for feeding during storms was stacks of hay, while the boys would be gone on their rounds of rodeos off and on during summers. Cal kept only one rider on the job, with him and himself, and then the boys drifting in for sometimes a couple of weeks and pitching in on the riding. It was pretty well kept up. Also, being that less riding was needed to be done during them months, and some could be held off, it worked well for when the boys would drift in to stay, as late fall would come, for fall and spring was the most rushing times, and when more riders would be needed. Brad would be about the only one who'd be apt to break loose most any time, but with making his winnings and connecting for contracts for Cal's stock at coming rodeos, he much more than earned his goings. With the two riders who'd trailed in the Longhorns, and Cal as the boss, that made 7 men to go on the fall works, which would keep them all busy until winter set in. By then it would or should be done, and only about 3 riders would be needed after that. Also about the same amount of the ranch hands to feed the hay them same hands had stacked the summer before. For the need of fresh and more saddle horses, the Horse Roundup was first, and being that none excepting a few renegades ranged over a day's ride from the ranch, Virginia was now on hand at that most every day, and later on with the cattle roundup, until the circles got too far for her to make and still be able to be back to the ranch when night come. For a cow camp is no place for a lady, and as welcome as one is, it put the boys out in many ways, like with their appearance and language, and especially when needing some indoor heat after long days of riding in the cold, windy, and snowy spells that come in the fall. Realizing that very well, Virginia was then contented to riding within easy distance of the ranch. For now, along with the riding to be done close to the ranch while they was away, her work and other interest in the house, there was the colt which drawed much of her attention and spent most of her spare time with. Virginia, after some long winters at college, would now be spending the coming one, the first one in years, at home at the ranch. She'd figured she had plenty of education to do, her and Cal, missing her more than anyone but himself ever knew while she was away, more than agreed with her. Enough of anything is a plenty, he'd said, and now that you're going on 19, a little more outside education sure won't hurt you none. Not that you're not already well educated that way, but I've had over 40 years of it, and every day I learn something to the good that shows me how little I know as compared to what all there is to know. It's the way in most everything, I guess, but the outside learning is a heap more helpful and interesting. Healthful, I think. With the coming winter, the colt would be a lot of added pleasure and company to her. She would care and train him so he would grow to be a fine horse. As for what purpose, she didn't know as yet. She knew some that his breed wasn't much good for anything but racing, and she didn't know how she could have use for any such. But time would tell, and now an important thing was to give him a name that would fit him during his colthood, as well as it would when he grew up. It should be a sort of high-sounding name and fitting to his breed. Then, thinking of the country he was from, and the way it had struck her while at college, how many persons of high standing was called colonel in that country, more than in any other, she figured that would identify him as to his country, also as to a good standing. She liked the name too, once she thought of it, and that's how come the little thoroughbred was named Colonel to stay. The weather had been good, near like Indian summer, since the few days of storm that had come when the bucking stock had been trailed home. The colt Colonel was now turned outside in a big corral most every day, one adjoining another corral, which was for feeding and where from a few to many horses was kept right long. With that company to rub nostrils through, the corral bars, the sun, and the big space to play in, he come right to in good shape, and got well weaned away from his home pastures, even his mother. The long trip and distance had a lot to do with that weaning. Then the trailing to the ranch added on till now it didn't matter to him much where he was. It of course helped some when Brad would come near, for he'd got to know him, and somehow as a good friend in connection to getting him away from that dark damp stall of the stockyards to the east. Then there was the big gray outlaw, which he'd got some comfort in being near to during the trip, then Roper during the trailing on in. Now Virginia was first up in his mind. She was the one who early in the morning fed him his grain, groomed and scratched him while he ate, then led him out into the big corral, to where a stream from a warm spring which run the winter through came under the bars into one corner of the corral. In the center was a manger, where she'd put in a forkful of special good hay, clover and alfalfa mixed. But before going to that, and soon as he got through drinking and was turned loose, the colt would have to have his roll, and a good one. It was a luxury he wouldn't have had at his home paddocks, not after a grooming such as the girl would give him, but she would just smile and enjoyed watching him as much as the colt enjoyed rolling, for that was more satisfying and natural than the grooming. Then one day, after the beef cattle was gathered to be trailed in and shipped, and the whole outfit came in to the ranch for one night's stay, there was amongst the saddle horses one very poor little colt of only a couple of months old, which Virginia, who'd rode out to meet the herd, at once spotted. Brad had found him some days before, all alone and just sort of moping along like hardly knowing where he was going, weak and wobbling from thirst and hunger, for the colt was still too young to get along without his mother. It was figured that as there was a few bunches of wild horses in that country, the colt was one of them, and had been left behind during a chase by some wild horse runners. He'd been too young to keep up, and it was a wonder the coyotes hadn't got him. There sure was no wildness about him that day when Brad rode up close, only just enough life to realize there was a horse near him, and not at all caring about the rider sitting on that horse. For, to his instinct, horseflesh meant life, such as his mother had given him. With a weak little nicker he'd raised his head at the nearness of the horse he could hardly see, and the way he tried to show how pleased he was sort of pitiful in the thought of the suffering that little feller had gone through. At a glance of him, Brad knew there was only two things to do. he seen that the colt couldn't make it to camp on his shaky legs. He would have to be carted in and taken care of. The only thing to do would be to shoot him and save him from slow suffering to death. Then he thought of Colonel at the ranch, and the good company this little feller would be for him during the winter, if he could be got there, made to live and get his strength again. With that in mind, Brad finished the circle ride he'd set out to make, and back to camp he got some of the boys to help him unload what grub there was in one of the wagon. It was no regular chuck wagon, as there was with the big outfits. A team was harnessed and hooked to it. Red jumped in with Brad, and the two drove across quite a few miles of rough country to as close to the colt as they could get. Then, taking one of the horses from the wagon, they easy enough got up to him. When he followed the horse back to the wagon, where he was soon caught and loaded with diluted and warmed canned milk, gradually poured down the colt's throat. Once in a while he seemed to revive some in getting strength. Bunch grass was even pulled and brought to him, but he was still too young to any more than nibble at that. When the beef was gathered and the outfit started back for the ranch, room was made for him in the wagon, up to within a few miles of the ranch. Then he was turned loose to go with the saddle horses the rest of the way. A little later, when Virginia rode up to the saddle horse bunch, and Red, who'd been driving them, seeing her looking at the colt in wonder, had to laugh some. "Yep," he says, riding nearer, "it's another one of Brad's thoroughbreds, only this one is not from the bluegrass country. He's from the sagebrush and Badland hills, but he's a sure enough thoroughbred just the same. A thoroughbred little wild horse. He don't look it now, does he? But the poor little feller sure ain't had no chance." Virginia gave him the chance, in the same corral with Colonel, where there was the warm water and choice hay. Warm milk and a mush of ground barley fed him every once in a while, laying in the sun during the day and in a warm stable during the night. No more exhausting himself roaming the country, looking for his mother or the water to quench his thirst. It was less than a week when he began to be up and a-coming, as close as he'd been to going to horse heaven. The hardiness of the wild horse, along with Virginia's good care, had pulled him through. With the two colts now and the care Virginia gave them, that turned out to be quite a chore to the girl's own doing and liking, and there was few days when she wasn't with 'em for long spells at a time, even during stormy weather. For if not in the stable, there was always some sheltered spots amongst the windbreaks of the sheds and many corrals, and the colts got their daily exercise, whether it snowed, rained, or the sun shined. It was with great interest that the girl watched the little wild colt, steady gaining strength, and a sort of rewarding surprise when one day, as she turned him out in the big corral, she seen him start to run, let out a squeal, and like he wanted to play. Colonel, far from having been neglected on account of the newcomer, and now being full of vigor, seemed as surprised at the colt's first sign of play as the girl was, and, like for encouragement, went to running circles around him, and to cutting some capers in trying to egg him on. It had been quite some puzzle to Colonel that day past when the little shrunk-up and starving wild colt was half carried and pulled in by Red and Virginia, to be laid close to the sunny side of the corral. At first he'd been half scared of the little feller, like it is with all horses, to sense and keep shy of any dying or dead animal, and he wouldn't come near unless Virginia was there while caring for him. Then it'd only be to take a sniff at a safe distance. It wasn't until the colt started to walk around some that he began to prance around him and showing off, and even though the sick little feller would only stand and watch at such goings-on, it sort of helped him with wanting to do the same, like he had at one time while he was with his mammy. He'd been a speedy one then too, but with all the suffering he'd gone through, that seemed a long time past and near forgotten. Colonel's acting up was good medicine towards making him remember. But even during his sick and recuperative spell, the little colt was good if not lively company to Colonel, and after the dangerous time was over and his first step faster than a walk was made, his strength, through Virginia's steady care, came fast and surprising. So well and out of danger finally, Virginia began to think of a fitting name for him too, a name fitting the breed of his ancestors or suggesting of their country the same as she had with Colonel. Thinking of such a breed, the name would have to be Spanish, for the Spaniards, having brought the first horses to America some few hundred years before, and this little feller being a descendant of them same horses, which had accumulated, spread over the whole Southwest, and gone wild as antelope, he should be named according. Virginia thought of many Spanish names, long and short, and not knowing as yet of what he'd turn out to be, she went on taking a chance, hoping he'd some day be as good a horse as a man had to be entitled to such a name as she decided on. She called him Charo, meaning top cowboy of the better class, and sort of Jim Dandy. His color was now a dark mouse color, but looking at the base of his ears, back of his elbows, and at his flanks, the girl figured that when spring come and he done his first shedding, he'd turn out to be a Gorola, pronounced Gruya, which is also a Spanish name. Virginia thought some of giving him that name, but she didn't like it quite well enough, and the color itself wouldn't be pretty. It's what's called a dirty gray, a mixture of iron gray and roan and sort of rusty. But the color is not what makes the horse, and knowing that very well, Virginia figured she'd make up by name what he lacked in color, and she'd see to it he'd have every chance to be a good horse. The winter set in and wore on with all going well, regardless of the tough weather that came, the colts getting the best of care, fed picked hay, right amounts of crushed barley, and warm spring water to drink from when they wished, got to playing and acting up so that as Virginia would sometimes watch 'em, she wondered if the 8-foot corral fence would be tall enough to hold 'em, but neither was of the high jumping breed, and even though they had good runs at it, the corral being big and roomy enough so it had often held 1,000 cattle, with plenty of space for 1,000 more, they always came to a slide or fast turn when the tall pole fence loomed up in front of them. In their play, feeding and resting, there was nothing come to disturb or stop them from any growth. All was to their advantage, and even the Charo had growed more middle on him than he should have, making him look sort of puny at both ends. That was to be expected with any colt when losing their mother too soon. Even the good care he'd got that couldn't have been helped. But that out of proportion middle didn't seem to at all bother his action once he got his strength, and when spring with green grass and clover would come he would soon enough lose that thick middle and get to regular shape. All went also well in general with the hip-o ranch and range. There was plenty of stacked and standing feed for all stock. Snows came at right amounts and time to ensure good moisture for the following spring and summer, and all hands was at the regular winter camps doing their regular work. Brad and Red was kept at the ranch most of the time on account they might hit out most any day and cross the mountains to do some contesting that would be pulled off along the coast. Jim, not being inclined that way, was at one of the winter camps where he and a couple of ranch hands batched and where over half of the hippo cattle was being kept track of and wintered. The other riders outside of the one which was kept on steady and was now at another winter camp was let go. With Brad and Red there wasn't so much for them to do, only lining out, breaking a few colts, while keeping tab on the strong cattle that was wintering on the range, and now and again bringing in a few that would need feeding, the feeding being done by the ranch hands. The bucking horses was also fed some, but with the well-sheltered pasture they was in, and the good standing feed that was there for the pawing, they seldom touched the hay that was spread out for them. They kept fat, wild, and snorty. It was about the same with the longhorn steers and bulls, and even though they did take on more hay than the horses did, on account of cattle don't paw for their feed as horses do, they only looked wild-eyed at the ranch hands that fed 'em, and the shaking of their threatening long horns as a warning they'd better stay on their hay rack was the only thanks them boys would get. Along about middle winter there come a notice of a good rodeo being pulled off away to the south and west. There would be quite a few following from then on, and Brad slipped on his best boots, took his pet spurs, and away he went. He done well there in the warm climes, so well that Red soon joined him, and now Cal was without any riders but himself at the ranch. But as that had been expected, he soon had one good one who had no rodeo ambition, to take their place until they returned. Then that rider would still be kept on the job, for by that time the spring works would be starting.